It wasn't a single explosive fight that led us to therapy. It was the opposite. It was a slow, creeping silence, 1,000 tiny paper cuts to the soul. Our arguments had become circular and exhausting, labyrinths of logic where I would enter with a clear, valid feeling and emerge hours later, confused, apologetic, and convinced I was the architect of my own misery. Ethan had a way of twisting my words, of holding a mirror up to my emotions that reflected them back as distorted and monstrous. "I'm not saying you're wrong to feel that way," he'd say, his voice a perfect symphony of calm reason. "I'm just saying that a more stable person might not have reacted so intensely." He used words like stable and intense like surgical tools, carefully and precisely, to dissect my confidence until there was nothing left but quivering insecurity. I was losing my mind. Or, more accurately, I was being convinced I was losing my mind. So when he was the one to suggest couples therapy, it felt like a lifeline. He sat me down on the sofa, his hand over mine, his eyes full of earnest concern. "I hate seeing you like this," he said. "I hate that we can't communicate. I think we need a professional, someone who can help us find our way back to each other. I found someone, a Dr. Albright. She's supposed to be one of the best." In that moment, he was the hero of our story, the man willing to do the hard work to save us. I was flooded with so much relief, so much love for him that I almost cried. It was proof, I thought, proof that he still cared, proof that I wasn't crazy. Our first session felt like a breath of fresh air. Dr. Albright's office was calm and neutral, a beige-toned sanctuary. She had a kind, intelligent face and a way of listening that made you feel truly heard. I laid out my feelings, my voice trembling slightly as I described the loneliness, the confusion, the feeling of constantly being on the defensive. Ethan listened, nodding sympathetically. When it was his turn, he was brilliant. He was vulnerable, self-deprecating. He admitted he wasn't a perfect communicator. He acknowledged that he tended to be overly logical and that it might come across as dismissive. "I just love her so much," she said, his voice thick with emotion as he reached for my hand, "and I feel like my own emotional limitations are hurting her. I'm here to learn how to be the husband she deserves." I left that session floating on a cloud of hope. We were finally doing it. We were communicating. We were on the same team. That hope was a drug, and I was an addict. It made me blind to the subtle shift that began in our second session. I was describing a recent argument, one where Ethan had promised to handle a bill, but had forgotten, resulting in a late fee. I explained that it wasn't the money that upset me, but the feeling that I couldn't rely on him. When I finished, Ethan turned to Dr. Albright, his face a mask of pained sincerity. "She's absolutely right," he said. "I did forget, and that's completely on me. I've apologized for it, and I will again. But what I'm struggling with, doctor, is the aftermath. My one mistake led to 3 days of crying, of her being unable to get out of bed. I want to take accountability for my actions, but I'm also walking on eggshells. I'm terrified that any small error on my part will trigger another major depressive episode." It was a masterstroke. He had taken my valid complaint, wrapped it in a blanket of agreement, and then expertly reframed it as a symptom of my emotional instability. Suddenly, the issue wasn't his unreliability, it was my disproportionate reaction. I was so stunned I didn't know what to say. I looked to Dr. Albright, expecting her to see through it, but she just looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "Clara, do you have a history of depression? Have you considered that your emotional responses might be amplified by an underlying condition?" I felt the floor drop out behind me. In the space of 30 seconds, I had gone from the wronged party to the patient. The therapy room, once a sanctuary, had become a courtroom, and I had been put on the stand. I tried to defend myself, but my words came out tangled and emotional, which I realized with a sickening lurch only proved his point. I left that session not with hope, but with a cold knot of dread in my stomach. The game had changed, and I didn't even know the rules. That session set the template for all the ones that followed. Therapy became Ethan's stage, and he was a virtuoso. He would come to each session prepared, with a calm, curated list of my recent episodes. He spoke the language of therapy fluently, using terms like emotional dysregulation, cognitive distortions, and trauma responses, all aimed at me. He painted me as a fragile, damaged creature he was desperately trying to love. He was the patient, stable husband, and I was the chaotic, unpredictable wife. And the most insidious part was that he wrapped it all in the language of love and concern. "It breaks my heart to see her like this," he'd say, shaking his head sadly. "She has so much goodness in her, but it's trapped behind this wall of anxiety." My reality began to warp. The constant professional validation of his narrative, echoed by Dr. Albright's increasingly pointed questions about my mental health, was a slow-acting poison. I started to believe them. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe my reactions were abnormal. Maybe I was emotionally unstable. I became quiet and withdrawn in our sessions, afraid that anything I said would be twisted and used against me. My silence, of course, was then presented as another symptom. "You see how she shuts down," he would say, his voice full of pity. "She's completely dissociated. She can't connect." The therapy sessions began to bleed into our life at home. Ethan would use Dr. Albright's words as a weapon. "Remember what Dr. Albright said about your catastrophic thinking?" he'd tell me calmly when I was upset about something. "You need to try and reframe this." The professional I had trusted to be an impartial mediator had become his unwitting accomplice, providing him with a licensed arsenal to use against me. He was no longer just my husband, he was my condescending amateur therapist. My world shrank. I stopped talking to my friends about our problems because I was ashamed. How could I explain what was happening without sounding like the crazy person Ethan and Dr. Albright were making me out to be? I felt a profound, suffocating loneliness, the kind that can only exist when you are lying next to someone every night. I was a ghost in my own marriage, and the only person who could see me was a therapist who was convinced I was a lunatic. The breaking point came not from a dramatic discovery, but from a mundane scheduling conflict. Dr. Albright had to reschedule our regular appointment, and her assistant called to move it to a different day. I was marking it on the calendar when I noticed something. We had been seeing her for 6 months, but the bill from my insurance company only showed up every other month. That was strange. I was sure our plan covered a portion of every session. Curiosity got the better of me. I logged into my insurance portal to check our claims history. I scrolled through the dates of our appointments with Dr. Albright, and then I saw it. A series of claims for a different therapist, a Dr. Evans, on alternating weeks. The patient listed was Ethan. The type of visit? Individual psychotherapy. For 6 months, Ethan had been seeing his own therapist. He had never mentioned it. I stared at the screen, my mind racing to make sense of it. Why would he keep that a secret? It didn't make any sense. Unless our sessions weren't about healing at all. Unless our sessions were about something else entirely. An idea so ugly and so terrifying I could barely let it form began to take shape in my mind. What if our sessions were just practice? What if he was using his individual therapy as a coaching session, learning the language, honing his techniques, strategizing the best way to present me as the problem? The thought was so monstrous, so Machiavellian, that I almost dismissed it as paranoia. I was becoming the person he described, seeing conspiracies everywhere. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I needed proof. I needed to know what was being said in those secret sessions. I knew it was a terrible violation of his privacy, but I also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my sanity was on the line. I needed to find a way to hear what he was saying when he thought I wasn't listening. The plan felt disgusting, a new low in a marriage that had become a landscape of lows. But it also felt necessary. Ethan had a habit of taking his individual therapy calls in his car, parked in our driveway for privacy. He'd say he needed to clear his head after the emotional intensity of the call. I bought a tiny audio recorder, a simple voice-activated device no bigger than my thumb. My hands shook as I taped it under the driver's seat of his car, hiding it deep within the springs and upholstery. I felt like a criminal, a spy in my own home. But as I walked away from the car, I didn't feel guilty. I felt a flicker of the woman I used to be, a woman who trusted her own instincts. The day of his next session with Dr. Evans, I felt sick with anxiety. I watched from the living room window as he went out to his car. He was on the phone for a full hour. I watched him gesticulate, nod his head, a thoughtful expression on his face. He looked like a man engaged in a serious, productive conversation about his own well-being. When he came back inside, he looked drained. He gave me a weak, sad smile. That was a tough one, really digging into some of my own issues. I just nodded, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I waited until he was in the shower. I slipped out to the car, my hands trembling as I retrieved the small device. I went to my own car, plugged the recorder into the auxiliary port, and put in my earbuds. I took a deep breath and pressed play. What I heard was not the voice of a man working on his own issues. What I heard was the voice of a predator, and I was his prey. The recording began with the pleasantries, Dr. Evans asking how he was feeling, and then Ethan started talking about me. But it wasn't a therapy session, it was a strategy session. Okay, so this week she had what I would classify as another abandonment response. I had to work late, and I called her to let me know. She reacted with what seemed like panic, accusing me of not prioritizing her. I'm thinking of bringing this up in our next session with Albright. What's the best way to frame that? Should I focus on my feelings of being smothered or on my concern for her clear attachment issues? Dr. Evans, his therapist, was actively helping him. Good, the doctor voice said. Focus on the concern. It's less accusatory. Use I statements. Say, I feel worried when I see you in so much pain over a simple change of plans. It validates her feeling while still highlighting the problematic nature of the response. I listened for a full hour, my body rigid with a horror that was beyond anything I had ever felt. I listened as my husband and his therapist workshopped my emotions, dissected my reactions, and scripted his lines for our next couple session. They were a team. They were co-conspirators. They discussed how to handle my tears, how to counter my arguments, how to use my own language against me. He wasn't in therapy to heal himself. He was in therapy to learn how to be a better manipulator. He was a student, and Dr. Evans was teaching him how to psychologically dismantle his own wife. The therapy sessions with Dr. Albright weren't just a stage. They were his final exam, a place where he could perform the character they had created. The most chilling part of the recording was the end. She's really starting to believe she's the problem, Ethan said, and I could hear the pride in his voice. It's working. I think a few more months and she'll be ready to admit she needs serious, long-term psychiatric help, maybe even inpatient. Dr. Evans agreed. Just keep building the narrative. Consistency is key. By the time this is over, you'll have a clear, documented history of her instability. It will be invaluable. Invaluable. The word echoed in my ears. Invaluable for what? For a divorce? For a custody battle? For a future where he could walk away with everything, leaving me with nothing but a psychiatric diagnosis and the world's belief that I was a crazy, unstable woman? The cold dread that had been my constant companion was burned away by a rage so clean and so absolute it felt like a religious conversion. I was not the patient. I was the victim of a conspiracy, and I had the proof. I sat in my car in the silent darkness of my garage, and I held the small, black device in my hand. It was a bomb. and I was going to walk into our next therapy session and detonate it. For the next few days, I was a ghost. I moved through the house, performed my duties, and spoke in monosyllables. Ethan interpreted my silence as a sign of my further decline. "You seem really disconnected," he said one evening, his voice dripping with faux concern. "Maybe we should talk to Dr. Albright about about getting you a referral for medication." I just looked at him, at this stranger with my husband's face, and felt nothing. The part of me that had loved him, the part of me that had hoped to save him, was dead. It had been methodically, systematically murdered, and in its place was a woman made of ice and fury. I made a copy of the recording, uploading it to a secure cloud server. I emailed a copy to myself and another to a new anonymous email address I had created. Then I contacted a lawyer, a woman who specialized in high-conflict divorces. I told her the entire story over the phone. She was silent for a long time after I finished. "In 30 years," she said, her voice grim, "I have never heard of a more calculated and diabolical case of gaslighting. The recording is everything. Do not let him know you have it. Do not confront him. Wait for the therapy session. Let him walk into the trap himself." The day of our next appointment with Dr. Albright felt like the final act of a very long, very sick play. I dressed carefully. I didn't want to look like a victim. I wanted to look like the woman I was before he had started to erase me. I was calm. The nervous, emotional woman who usually sat in that beige room was gone. My composure seemed to unsettle Ethan. He kept looking at me in the car, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. The session began as it always did. Dr. Albright asked how our week had been. Ethan launched into his prepared monologue. He spoke about my abandonment issues, my panic response to him working late. He used all the right words. He looked at Dr. Albright with his sincere, worried eyes. He was perfect. He was a monster. I let him talk for 10 minutes. I let him paint his final, masterpiece portrait of me as a hysterical, broken woman. Dr. Albright listened, nodding sympathetically, taking notes. She was completely ensnared in his web. When he was finished, there was a pause. Dr. Albright turned to me. "Clara," she began, her voice soft and full of therapeutic pity, "it sounds like this was a very difficult week for you. Do you want to talk about what was going on in your head when Ethan called?" I looked at her. Then I looked at Ethan, who was watching me with an expression of patient concern. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I do." I reached into my purse and took out my phone and a small Bluetooth speaker. I placed it on the coffee table between us. "It's not a game," I said, my eyes locked on his. "It's a strategy session." I pressed play. The voice of his therapist, Dr. Evans, filled the quiet room. "Focus on the concern. It's less accusatory. Use I statements." Then Ethan's voice, clear and confident. Her clear attachment issues. The color drained from his face. He looked like he had been turned to stone. Dr. Albright's mouth had fallen open, her professional composure completely shattered. She stared at the speaker as if it were a venomous snake. I let the recording play. I let them both hear him strategize, rehearse, and gloat. I let them hear him talk about building a documented history of her instability. I let him hear his pride as he said, "She's really starting to believe she's the problem." When I finally pressed pause, the silence in the room was absolute. It was a silence so heavy, so complete, it felt like a physical weight. Dr. Albright was pale, her face a mask of horror and dawning professional shame. She looked from me to Ethan, who was staring at the floor, a man utterly and completely exposed. "I believe," I said, standing up, "that this session is over." I picked up my purse and walked to the door. I didn't look at Ethan. I didn't need to. I had taken his weapon, the very thing he had used to try and destroy me, and I had turned it back on him. I had not only saved myself, I had forced them both to see the truth. As I walked out of the building and into the sunlight, I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel sad. I felt the quiet, profound, and unshakable stability of my own reclaimed mind. I was not who he said I was. I was who I had always been, and I was finally free. Walking away from that office was like walking out of a thick, suffocating fog into the crisp, clean air of a mountain morning. The world seemed sharper, colors more vibrant. The constant, low-grade hum of anxiety and self-doubt that had been the background music of my life for years was finally silent. For the first time, the only voice in my head was my own. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic, but it was a storm I watched from a safe distance. Dr. Albright called me that evening, her voice shaking. She apologized profusely, a torrent of professional shame and personal regret. She admitted she had been completely manipulated, that Ethan's performance was one of the most convincing she had ever encountered. She offered to testify on my behalf, to provide a statement detailing the session and the contents of the recording. She also informed me she had a professional and ethical obligation to report Dr. Evans to the state licensing board for his complicity in a coordinated campaign of psychological abuse. Ethan hadn't just destroyed our marriage, he had destroyed 2 therapists' careers. My lawyer, armed with the recording and a sworn statement from a horrified Dr. Albright, went on the offensive. We filed for divorce, citing extreme psychological cruelty. When Ethan's lawyer was presented with the evidence, the fight went out of them. There was no defense. There was no narrative he could spin that would explain away that recording. He was trapped in a cage of his own words. He didn't contest the divorce. He didn't ask for a single thing. He just wanted to disappear. He signed the papers, and just like that, the man who had been the suffocating center of my universe for a decade was gone. The legal victory was clean and swift, but the personal recovery was a slower, more complicated process. The first few months were a strange mix of euphoria and terror. I reveled in the simple freedoms I hadn't realized I'd lost, making a decision without having to justify it, having an emotion without it being diagnosed, speaking my mind without my words being twisted. But I was also haunted. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, convinced I could hear his calm, rational voice explaining to me why my fear was an overreaction. The gaslighting had been so effective, so insidious, that it had left deep grooves in my psyche. I was free, but his ghost still lingered. I knew I couldn't heal on my own. I had seen the dark side of therapy, but I also knew that the right kind of therapy could be a lifeline. I found a new therapist, a woman who specialized in trauma and narcissistic abuse. In our first session, I told her the whole story, my voice steady. When she was finished, she didn't offer pity. She offered understanding. She tried to convince you that your reactions were the problem, when in reality, your reactions were a perfectly sane response to an insane situation. Her words were a balm to a wound I didn't even know was still bleeding. Slowly, with her help, I began to rebuild my sense of self. I learned to trust my own perceptions again. I learned that my emotions weren't symptoms of instability, they were signals, my own internal compass, and he had spent years trying to break it. I reconnected with the friends he had pushed away. I had to endure the shame of explaining the truth of my marriage, but they responded not with judgment, but with love and anger on my behalf. We knew something was wrong, my best friend admitted. We just didn't know how to help you. He made it seem like we were the enemy. I realized he hadn't just isolated me, he had isolated us all. The hardest part was reclaiming the parts of my life he had colonized. He had always claimed to be the logical, intellectual one in the relationship. He had managed our finances, our investments, our long-term plans, all while subtly convincing me I was too emotional and disorganized to handle such things. After the divorce, I sat down with a financial advisor, terrified I would make a mess of it all. But as we went through the paperwork, I discovered that I understood it perfectly. I wasn't disorganized, I was capable. His control hadn't been about my incompetence, it had been about his own insecurity. The final piece of my recovery was rediscovering my own joy. I started painting again, something he had always subtly discouraged, calling it a messy and emotionally draining hobby. I took a solo trip to Italy, something he would have called reckless and irresponsible. I learned to cook the spicy, flavorful food he had always claimed was too aggressive for his palate. I filled my life with all the colors and textures and tastes he had tried to paint over in his preferred shade of beige. I was building a life that was authentically, unapologetically mine. I never saw Ethan again. I heard through the grapevine that he moved to a different city after the divorce. I sometimes wonder if he tried to find a new audience for his performance, a new woman to cast in the role of his unstable partner. But I try not to think about him. He is a closed chapter, a lesson learned in the harshest way possible. He thought he was the author of my story, but he was just a character in it, and a minor one at that. He was the villain I had to overcome to find my own strength.